Hi everyone, welcome to our October Book Club Favorites event, where we will be discussing Jess Kidd's newest novel, The Night Ship. We're joined today by Jess Kidd, the award-winning author of Himself, Mr. Flood's Last Resort, and Things in Jars. We are also joined by our advertising pro, Holly Clater, to help lead the discussion. Before we get into our discussion, I want to let everyone watching know 3 lucky viewers could win a copy of The Night Ship and an Atria tote bag. To enter for your chance to win, just leave a question in the comment section of this video, and we will do our best to answer as many questions as possible on screen today. And now on to book club. Jess, can you tell us a little bit about The Night Ship to kick us off?
I can, Colleen. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Well, so in June 1629, the Batavia, which was the flagship of the Dutch East India Company, was en route to the Spice Islands when she wrecks on a coral reef off the coast of Western Australia. And what happens next is one of maritime history's biggest horror story, and something I didn't know about until I started researching the book. So I basically tell this story through 2 children over 300 years apart, who are both living on this island where all the action happened. So there's Micah, who is part of this original sailing, and Gil, who in 1989 is sent to live with his grandfather, who's a crayfisher on the island. So it's really a tale about the worst, but also the best of human behavior, and really our capacity to hope and to love and ultimately to survive, with no plot giveaways.
Fabulous. Yeah, well, I am so excited to be talking with you too. I've been a big fan of all your books, so I've been waiting to read The Night Ship. It did not disappoint. I really did love that it was based off a true real life event that happened. I wanted to just talk a little bit about what inspired you to write about Batavia and kind of, the research process that went into discovering all that.
Absolutely. Well, it's a friend of mine brought me this idea because I was kind of casting around for another story. I'd already written Things in Jars, which was set in Victorian London, and I knew I wanted to write a historical novel. And a friend of mine brought me this story and said, "You've got to write this. It's an incredible story." I hadn't heard of it. And I started researching it, and almost instantly I was completely hooked. The second thing was like, wow, this is a massive story to tell. How do I even go about it? And then also it's going back far further in time to 1629. So there were a lot of kind of those things, but really it was the intrigue on my part that there's just enough that we know about it but then still there's tantalizing glimpses that we just can't work out. So I think it was really that hooked me into it. I was also really interested at sort of exploring through a kind of two character, a dual kind of timeline as well, which I didn't know about until I started off with the research. So I already had the idea of exploring it through Micah, the child on board, but Gil came a bit later.
Okay. Yeah. Do you want to ask the next question about that?
Yeah, actually, I was going to ask you a little bit about how that kind of came to be about writing from two perspectives. And if you could kind of talk a little bit about writing from kids' perspectives, because I think that's really interesting as well.
Absolutely. Well, writing from a child's perspective was quite an early decision. As I say, this is like one of maritime history's worst horror stories. So it was actually a really hard story to try and frame, to try and present. And I knew I wanted a child's eye view, just because I really feel like kids are world inventors, and I love inventing worlds myself. And I thought they're going to be our guides into this like really difficult terrain, basically. So I wanted that questioning, that curiosity that children bring to any narrative, but also there's lots of jewels in this. Yeah. So there's a dual timeline, but there's also a dual element of the child's experience in an adult world. So that was really important way in for me. So I suppose really also when I started with Micah and I started researching, how the ship wrecked and what happened afterwards. So basically we have the wreck, then we have like a kind of a massacre, and there's all of this conflict on the island. But what I started becoming really interested in was the follow-on. So from the time when the ship wrecked afterwards, when it was rediscovered, the archaeology, and so the later communities that were using the same island like as a seasonal base for fishing. And one of the things that I found out quite early on was this idea that the fishers would bring their families out to these islands, which are barren, tiny little islands in the middle of nowhere. And this idea that the families would be joining them at Easter time or so forth. And I thought, what would it be like to be a child here with all this kind of strange history as well? So Gil came along as a way to kind of just tell that ongoing, complete story of what we know now and what happened then, and have that kind of past in the present, I suppose.
Do you think that it was more fun to kind of, because this does deal with some, darker pieces of history, some intense pieces of history. Was it fun to kind of also have like the child's aspect and like view because of that? It brought maybe some levity to the writing. Just wondering if that changed your process at all.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, it's spot on really with that. I think because it was a very difficult story to tell, it's quite gritty. Bringing the children in allows an element of playfulness. And I was very inspired by films like Pan's Labyrinth that deal with real historical situations, but also layer on that element of fairy tale or playfulness, and really how a child responds very differently to a traumatic event than an adult. So really to bring it in as a child's point of view, I could bring that element. And even though it reaches some quite difficult places, there's still that kind of humor, there's that curiosity. Quite early on, I had this idea that it was really about imagination as an act of survival. And so there is still that kind of element of play all through it. And also the best thing was I got to go on a replica boat and pretend that I was 9 years old. So really, I'm running around it.
Yeah, I love that.
From that point of view.
Would you be able to talk a bit about that sort of immersion research?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to, part of my love of writing historical fiction is the research, and because it's a story in its own right. With this, I traveled, it was pre-pandemic, I traveled to the Netherlands, I traveled to Australia, and I hadn't even been to Australia when I heard this story. And so I was traveling over the other side of the world. I went out to the Abrolhos Islands, these wild little tiny islands, in a like aircraft. So I really kind of physically felt like I was inhabiting the world, which is really very much my approach on research. It has to have kind of a physicality to it, if that makes sense, because I really want to immerse the reader in it. I want you to come into that world with me. And so it's very kind of sensory with me. I like to as I say, like have quite hands-on in terms of like running around a replica ship, gives me a sense of how the different levels works and how long it takes me to run from one end to another. So there was a lot of that kind of stuff going on. But the other thing that really helped me was meeting the experts, so the historians, the archaeologists, and the everyday people that came into contact with this story and their passion for telling it. And also their passion for a fictional account of it as well, that they really felt that what I was doing was a great way to bring it to other people, other readers.
Wow, that's so great that you got to have that sort of research process, and that just sounds like it definitely did bring a added depth to it. We can definitely tell your sensory descriptive language is just beautiful in the book. So a little bit of a different point, but sort of on the same path, because the contents of the story are so dark, and you often tend to write very kind of gothic, eerie stories, but I feel like you do it in a way that brings a different light to things like ghosts and monsters. I feel like that's a very strong talent of yours throughout your novels, and especially in The Night Ship. So I thought maybe you could talk about that, the creative ways that you kind of bring death and spookiness into your stories, especially in this time of year. We're getting closer to the spooky Halloween spirit. So yeah, could you talk a bit about your like fascination with ghost stories and kind of how you bring that in a different light in your stories?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think with this, I was very fortunate in that I had that I explored the idea of superstitions through two groups of people. So there were the original sailors and also the crayfishers. Now, I think any job which has an element of danger to it also has that element of magical thinking or that kind of lore that comes along with it. But there was also a lot of folklore and stories in from the Netherlands and also from the indigenous Australian folklore. So I was trying to kind of weave lots of different storytelling into the main story, which I love doing anyway. But I think really the supernatural element often is just about it's just as important, I think, to me as the ghosts and the kind of supernatural spirits, but also who's seeing them and what purpose they fulfill. And I think in terms of the two children, they both kind of summon this very strange, not to give too much away, strange water creatures that are comparable, because we have these kind of water monsters from myths all around the world. So as a way to kind of explain what's going on. So you have Micah, who's able to chase this demon all around the ship, potentially also getting to know everybody on the ship. And for Gil, it's a slightly more reflective process. So in both children, it's a way for them to explore what's going on. And again, this idea of like the act of imagination as an act of survival, that they're sort of seeking for solutions in the world that they find themselves in, to try and answer the questions they've got in their own mind.
Yeah, well, and that really ties back to your writing process that you talked about, especially with the folklore. And I love that you said it brings a sort of understanding to the happenings going around it. So that's just amazing. I love to hear about that. So thank you.
To some extent, that reminds me of how, every little kid, well, I'd like to say it's every little kid because I definitely had one, had an imaginary friend, and they were just, what you needed at that moment, whether that was, somebody to laugh with or, to have tea parties with or whatever. So I just kind of always looked at them as friendly, I guess, because I wanted to look at like each kid having that as like the friend that they filled whatever need that they were looking for at that time. Just kind of switching gears, one formatting aspect that I noticed is that as the novel concludes, and I don't know if this is just me looking too deep into it, it seems like the chapters become shorter. And there's this like feeling of like the pacing getting faster. kind of like the can't catch your breath type moment. Is that something that I'm just noticing, or was that a choice that you made? I'm just wondering.
I'm glad you noticed that. It was a definite choice that I made. I mean, apart from the kind of dual narrative and two different times and the adult and child layering, there's also like the way that time behaves is quite different in the two time periods. And I'm switching from one narrative viewpoint to another. And when I started thinking about doing this, I realized it was a bit of a high wire act to do, because as a reader, I don't know if you feel like this, sometimes on a dual narrative you can get more engrossed with one point of view than the other. So I felt like it was really important to make them both equally engrossing, and also the fact that there are mirrorings throughout, so they both have a dead mother and a sort of absent father, and they both journeying to a place that they don't, they're uprooting. So there's similarities, and they're connected also by a physical object. So there was a kind of switching between these two worlds that does speed up a little bit towards the end, as you say. I think this also was the first time that I really dipped into my past as a short story writer, because I started off writing short stories and flash fiction in particular, which I absolutely loved. And so I really wanted to start giving the reader these really kind of snappy shots into a world that's actually quite difficult to sustain, because as you say, it's quite a dark story, and as the story unfolds, anyone who knows the Batavia stories knows that it does get very difficult for the survivors after the shipwreck. So it was a case of giving the reader enough of that insight without making it too traumatic, actually, as well, but also to allow that pacing to bring the story to its sort of to its end, really. So hopefully it's satisfying to switch between the two viewpoints. I know I have met people who've read the alternate chapters, so they've read all the chapters from one child and all the chapters from the other, which
That's
I thought
interesting.
really, really interesting. And I hadn't even thought about reading it like that, so I'd be really curious to know if anyone out there has done that. It was on an event, and someone came up to me and said, "Is that how you meant it?" And I was like, "Well, no." Sort of alternating, but that's fine.
I gotta go back and try that now.
Yeah, definitely. I think I will after a period of time when I've forgotten all my own characters. I'll go back and see how it works.
Yes, yeah. Well, speaking of characters, actually, on a little lighter note, I loved the cast of characters that were in there, and you did such a great job at switching between both viewpoints and bringing so many lively characters into the story. So I thought we could talk maybe about our favorite characters. I loved both children's point of views. I was particularly drawn to Gil's just because every chapter I just felt so heartbroken for him too, and I just wanted to keep hearing more about him. But I also just really loved his relationship with Enkidu, his tortoise. That was just my favorite part. So I think that also brought me back to Gil every time. So if, as a writer, and Colleen, please chime in about your favorite one too, but as you were writing it, did you have a favorite character you were drawn to?
I mean, I think my favorite character was a tortoise, which I think is not.
Mine too.
I'm glad. I was gonna say, like, not to disrespect any of the other characters that are obviously human, but yeah, I get always drawn to pets.
Absolutely, it was his little friend.
It is really interesting. I mean, sometimes I don't necessarily know who's going to turn up in a novel until I start writing it. And with Enkidu, I just got this sense of a little creature coming towards me. And then I was like, looking, what is it? What is it? Oh, it's a tortoise. Okay, out in the middle of the ocean off the coast of Western Australia. That makes perfect sense. And so it's really hard to pick. I mean, what I did also with this book is I sort of mixed up the fiction with the fact. So I did try and tell the story of some of the people who really were there in the original shipwreck. So when you get to the back of the book, you will see who really was on the island. So I sort of wove together those things, and that felt like a huge responsibility, but also because this was the first time that I'd used a real event, a real historical event. In Things in Jars, I'd been inspired by real people from history, but I'd fictionalized them. But this was the first time. But really, as I started researching the survivors and what happened to them, I found, I mean, we don't have a huge amount of information. We've got archaeology, we've got a couple of accounts, but it was just things like people's nicknames and what their occupation might have been on board, and that was enough to kind of spark that I want to get to know this person. So that was quite a challenge. But I think also both children, I really wanted them to be quite different in a lot of respects, but also to kind of mirror each other and to work sort of together across time. So for me, they're inseparable, even though they're over 300 years apart. In a way, they kind of complement each other by telling the whole story, I suppose.
Amazing. I loved so much depth to it, that, you know, these people that inspired you, but also all of the fictionalized characters and character traits that you brought to it. It just so many layers and great depth to the story.
Well, we have 1,000 more questions we could ask you, but we're getting questions from people who are viewing live, so I want to make sure we get to those. So the first one comes from Mary, who's watching on YouTube, and she asks, how long did the full research process take to get like all of the events, and how long did that take you?
Oh, thank you, Mary. I think it took some time. This took a lot longer than my previous novels. So there was the initial actually going to Australia, going to the Netherlands, but also I was really fortunate in that I kept in touch with a lot of the people that I first met up with, and actually became friends with some of them, which was really nice. So I was able to show early drafts to people and share that with them. So it was the research was really an ongoing process, because I was having to learn about 1629, but also 1989, and these sort of very different communities as well. And there always seemed to be a fact that I didn't know, like I'd have to get a book about ship's rigging and like learn how to rig it. I felt like it was important to learn how to rig an entire sailing ship.
Absolutely.
But there is a point with writing a historical novel where you've got to work out what's procrastination and what's just the delight of the research element. So I would say kind of like it was about 3 years from the start to kind of to finish, I suppose, in a way. And it was something that I had in my mind, obviously from the point when I was told the story initially.
Wow, I mean, I guess that makes sense. It is quite a lot of research. It's just, that's a commitment. 3 years of living in that kind of, event and in that space is a long time.
I think so, but I think it was also about this sense of getting it right and telling the best version of the story, because that was something else I loved about it. There's not a huge amount of fiction using the story or telling the story. There's a lot of brilliant non-fiction. So it was just really, and also as I went on my journeys and met people, there was always this kind of sense that, I wanted to try and communicate that passion they had for the story and for telling it and for the people associated with it, I suppose.
I love that. So wait, before we go on to the next question, I just want to give another call out that we are running a sweepstakes. You can enter to win by commenting a question below on wherever you're watching, Facebook or YouTube, and you could be entered to win a finished copy of The Night Ship and a tote bag. The next question that I just wanted to bring up is, I love this question so much. Ellen on Facebook is wondering if you thought about Lord of the Flies at all while you were writing The Night Ship.
That's a really good question, Ellen. Yeah, I mean, I think that came up as an early comparison. Certainly, I think through working with people, that did come up in my mind. I think largely we have like the actions of children there. There are scenes which kind of replicate that later in the novel, where you do see kind of behavior of children that is quite disturbing, without giving anything away, but at the same time I really very much wanted there also to be that duality of the child adult world. So both of those children are really existing in the adult world and trying to understand it. But it was definitely that kind of sense of being uprooted and being lost and and having to reform communities and reform, I suppose, hierarchies as well happens, and the kind of power struggles that happen. I mean, really, also, I think there was an element of this kind of worst and best of human behavior that really fascinated me, and this is how things panned out on the island as well.
That's really interesting. I think like kind of the worst and best is a really, sometimes I feel like that's what we're living now. And I think it's such an interesting way to explore that is through history instead of having to live current events all the time. Holly, did you want to ask the next question from Rusty?
Absolutely, sure. Rusty on YouTube is wondering if you're planning on writing another historical novel based in Australia. So I know you've had a few based in other places, but this one's from Australian folklore. So what do you think?
I would love to. I mean, I think folklore really is a really big way in for me, and just storytelling in general. I mean, my background's part of a very big Irish family where with a lot of very good storytellers, more oral tradition. So I'm always drawn towards folklore for that reason. And I loved visiting Australia, and it's such a big country, and there's so much more. So I would really, really enjoy to do that, actually. So anyone who has any stories, bring them to me. And then hopefully, you know, a couple of years' time, I might be sitting here again saying, thanks to whoever. I'm halfway around the world again.
On that sort of same note, I am just personally wondering if you have like an event brewing in your mind or something on you that's been piquing your interest that you've been looking into a little more, or perhaps thinking about maybe writing about.
I have. I mean, I've actually started work on my next novel, which is something from further back again. So the world of mythology, actually. So Greek mythology. So that's what I've been having a lot of fun with. And so yeah. So I think. I mean, I just love. Yeah. I mean, I always keeping a lookout. I tend to. One of the things I tend to do is keep like little index cards with like different things. They've got very strange kind of like tabs on them, so it's like spooky stuff, weird history. That's got quite a few index cards, so always on the lookout.
Oh, good. So fun. Well, you know, I will be first in line, so I cannot wait to read that.
Thank you.
That's so exciting. Okay, so the next question comes from Facebook from Vesna, and she would like to know, so she has two questions. One is, what do you hope your readers take away from this story? And two is kind of a really fun question. She says her book club loves to pair a signature cocktail and food with the book that they pick. So do you have a suggestion for either like a cocktail or a food for her book club?
Oh my goodness, that's such a brilliant question. I suppose I think to take away would be an interest in the story and the history surrounding it as well. And because I think that's what's come across with a lot of the readers that I've met on the road and through various events, is they've said, I hadn't even heard of this story. And I went off and I looked into it and I terrified myself. But then I also read this and left with a sense that there is still hope for humankind. So I suppose there is that. I think also, like, my first idea when I'm writing anything is to take the reader into like an immersive world. So hopefully they followed me through a world and out again the other side, and felt that was a, you know, they really got something from that. I'd really hope they'd fall in love with the two children, because they honestly the nicest, the best characters that I've written in a long time. So I've really enjoyed writing them. In terms of cocktail, though, that's a tricky one, because I would say that on board the Batavia, it depends. I mean, if you were like 3 months into the journey, all of the water would be mostly worms. So,
maybe some pure water.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure that would be. And then you maybe have a ship's biscuit, which they used to call teeth breakers. So I don't know. I don't know. Excuse me, if that's the ideal cocktail food pairing. But I would suppose anything maritime has to have a bit of rum in it. So I would go for that, maybe.
That was fair. Yeah, that would work, I feel like.
Yeah. Great. That's such a good question. I'll try to think of some things too. We do have one more question too. This one is from Nancy on YouTube. She says that both children don't really fit into societal expectations. How did you decide to link them in this way? So kind of giving them both that same dynamic of being a little, outside of the society they're living in.
Yeah, that's really what I was aiming for, that outsider point of view. And I think also I'd explore this idea of kind of gender fluidity in Things in Jars, with a Victorian lady detective who has to present herself in different ways in order to have access all areas. So I'd already explored that, and Micah does similar thing. I mean, she's a highborn female girl passenger, and she is only allowed at certain parts of the boat, of the ship. So she dons a disguise as a cabin boy in order to move around the ship. And this was a fascination for me. Gil also sort of experiments with his own outfits and things like that. So it was really important that that they were sort of like slightly outsider, but also very curious and able to negotiate these kind of rules. And so through the children, you kind of see these rules as kind of quite flimsy and quite random. Because especially with Gil, I mean, Gil is his own person. And I think that was something that there's a line which I can't barely remember, although I'd written it myself, with this idea that the whole world can think you're wrong as long as one person thinks you're just right. And I think that really summed a lot of it up for me with the children. I think also there is this sense with Gil that he is living in a very sort of masculine culture at the time, with the crayfishing community, and he doesn't fit into that box. And initially there is this sort of conflict between him and his grandfather, but really that kind of that development of their relationship, and they kind of ultimately learning how to accept each other is a really strong thing for me.
Yeah, I love that. That's such a great sentiment to bring from both characters. So thank you.
And I think that explanation of things can seem so normal to adults, and maybe we don't question things as much anymore. But then when a child asks you a question that can seem so simple, and yet it kind of like blows your world up because you're seeing it from such like an innocent perspective of just questioning why things are the way they are. I absolutely love that idea.
Yeah.
Well, we have taken up more than the allotted time that we promised you. So I just wanted to thank you so much, both of you, for an incredible discussion. And before we go, I just want to give one last reminder that you can still post a question in the comment section to be entered to win a copy of The Night Ship and a tote bag. I also wanted to give a quick call out that our next book club pick will be Colleen Hoover's much anticipated new novel, It Starts With Us. You can join our Facebook group or follow us on Instagram to get the latest updates. And you can keep up with Jess by following her on Instagram or Twitter. And finally, Jess and Holly, I just want to thank you so much for joining us. This was an amazing discussion, and I hope you guys have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.